All right, this is chapter 5, the integumentary system, or the skin. It's a long chapter. It's our first organ system. And so we're going to talk about the layers of the skin, the strata of the epidermis, keratin and melanin, where they're produced and how they're produced. We'll talk about the layers of the dermis, and then the accessory structures, hair follicles, sebaceous glands, and sweat glands. The skin is an example of a membrane. It's a simple organ, two tissues, an epithelial tissue on top of a connective tissue. It's one of a bunch of different types of membrane, but it turns out it covers our entire external surface, so it's a large organ. The skin is really epidermis, the upper layer, which is an epithelial tissue, and the dermis, the lower layer, a connective tissue. Okay, below the skin lies more connective tissue, the hypodermis. The hypodermis is either fat, adipose tissue, or loose connective tissue. Okay, so again, the two layers of the skin. The upper layer is the epi. Epi means upper dermis, so epi is above the dermis. This is a keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. Stratified means there are many layers of cells. Squamous means some of the cells, at least, are flat. Okay, and at the top layer of this, the stratum cornea contains flat cells full of keratin. The bottom layer, here it's labeled stratum germinativum, but it's also called the stratum basale. These are where the cells are that produce melanin. Okay, and this is an actual picture of thick skin right here. And it shows the stratum germinativum, stratum spinosus, stratum granulosus, stratum lucidum, and stratum cornea. These are the strata of the skin. Okay, then below the dermis, or below the epidermis, is the dermis. The dermis is a connective tissue. It is irregular, dense, fibrous connective tissue. Irregular means that the fibers are not straight. They are in swirls or circles. And the primary fibers here are collagen. There are some elastin. The primary cells are fibrocytes, but there's lots of accessory structures in there, and I'll talk about those later. So let's get back to the epidermis. Here's another picture. Stratified squamous epithelium. These cells look mostly all alike. They are keratinocytes. These are cells that will gradually produce keratin, keratohyalin, and some lipids. And these cells, as they move from the bottom to the top, which they do, these cells are going to flatten. They'll accumulate proteins and lipids and eventually die. And the cells in the stratum corneum are dead. They're full of lipids and keratin, and they're going to be shed. This is what makes the outer layer of the skin kind of protective. It's got a thick layer of dead cells on the top, filled with some tough proteins that are hard for organisms to attach to. They're antibacterial, antifungal, and then they're going to be shed. So even if they're infected, they wind up being shed and they're dead. So they can't support a virus or a fungus. The bottom of the skin, the stratum basale, the cells look more cuboidal, and these are cells undergoing mitosis. And some of the cells here are actually called melanocytes, and they produce the skin pigment melanin. And they transfer that pigment to other cells in melanosomes, and so are going to be able to distribute it throughout the epidermis. Again, the epidermis contains there's thick skin and thin skin. Here you can see, again, that picture I showed you in the beginning, but it also, here's the diagram that's showing the cell movement. In this stratum basale or stratum germinativa, these cells are undergoing mitosis. Okay, and they are producing new cells, and some of those cells are pushed towards the surface. And as those cells that move towards the surface, they start developing these structures that are found in the dead cells: keratin, keratohyalin, the lipids that are released from the lamellar bodies. These things are all going to protect the skin. I did mention skin color. The melanocytes are producing melanin. And here you can see a melanocyte in a diagram. And this is a large cell that's anchored in the stratum basale. And it produces melanin, but it transfers the melanin in little vesicles to other cells. And the melanin winds up being distributed throughout the layers of the epidermis. The melanin production, some of us are producing much more melanin than others, and so we have darker skin. Others, all of us, though, can produce more melanin if our skin is exposed to sunlight. By tanning, we will produce more and more melanin, and that melanin will then make the skin darker. And the purpose of melanin is to prevent damage to the skin by ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light can damage the proteins and particularly the DNA of the skin. There are other things that can give the skin color. For those of us with light-colored skin, blood flow can change skin color, so it's reddish. There can be changes in skin color due to decreased oxygen content. That can make the skin bluish, and this is called cyanosis. And then certain other things, pigments, can accumulate in the skin like keratin. With skin color, again, there's another picture of these melanocytes. What skin color really tells us about is where our ancestors came from. That in areas of the tropics where the sun is most intense, particularly in areas where there's grasslands or desert, it's really important for people to have protection from ultraviolet light. And so that protection means that they genetically produce lots of melanin and melanosomes all the time because sunburn is such a serious problem. Okay, below the epidermis is the dermis, and there are two layers of the dermis, the upper dermal layer or papillary layer. This is a highly folded layer that these folds, these dermal papillae, help attach the epidermis to the dermis. They also give us the ridges in our skin that help us grip things when we're trying to hold on to something. And then the larger area below that is the reticular layer. The reticular layer is thicker. It's going to contain more collagen, more elastin, but it'll also contain lots of accessory structures. The epidermis has very few blood vessels, very few sensory cells, almost none. There are some pores that pass through it and hair follicles pass through it, but no blood vessels. The dermis, on the other hand, is very busy, full of blood vessels in its upper portion and in the lower portion. It contains many, many sensory cells and nerve cells. The dermis also has, particularly the papillary layer, also has lots of immune cells in it. And then you see these accessory structures, hair follicles, hair nails, nails, sebaceous glands, and sweat glands. The majority of the tissue, though, is this irregular, dense, fibrous connective tissue. And this is particularly in the reticular layer. And these fibers are very, very abundant, and they are what gives the lower layer of the skin its strength and elasticity. The fibers of the reticular layer are oriented in particular directions more than others. These produce lines of cleavage or tension. The skin will stretch easiest perpendicular to those lines. It also heals differently if those lines are cut, like by a scar or an incision. If an incision is made parallel to those lines, it heals well without much scar tissue forming. If the incision or cut happens across those lines or perpendicular, then you get lots of scar formation. Okay, one of the most important things in the skin and the dermis are hair follicles. Hair follicles are really busy structures. Hairs themselves are columns of dead keratinized epithelial cells that are glued together, or they kind of adhere to one another. The shaft of the hair is what we see above the skin, but there is a root below the skin that lies within the hair follicle, and the bulb at the base of the follicle contains the living tissue where the hair grows. The hair also has a medulla, a core, and a cortex that surrounds that medulla, and then it has a cuticle on the outer part of the hair, and it's just how these cells are cemented together. At the base of each hair, there's this little papillae or bulb where the hair is growing. Nerve cells and blood vessels will nourish that growing hair. The hair follicle also has attached to it lots of structures. It has a smooth muscle attached to it that can cause it to stand more erect. This is the erector pili. It also has an oil gland, a sebaceous gland, that produces a lubricating and waterproofing oil that will come out and waterproof the hair and the surface of the skin. And there are some sweat glands that open particularly onto into the hair follicle. So there's a picture of the sebaceous gland. They are always connected with hair follicle. The material they secrete is called sebum. It's oily, contains fatty acids. It's strongly antibacterial. It waterproofs the skin in the hair follicle. It can be removed by too much hand washing or shampooing. A blocked hair follicle or blocked sebaceous gland becomes inflamed, and that's the source of acne. Okay, another gland type that you find in the skin are the sweat glands. And there's two types of sweat glands. There are the eccrine sweat glands that produce a very watery fluid that travels by a duct right through the epidermis and is deposited on the surface of the skin, and it evaporates to cool the skin. Then in certain parts of the body, there are apocrine sweat glands, and these sweat glands are located deeper into the dermis and in the hypodermis, and they empty into a hair follicle and onto a hair. And these sweat glands aren't active until puberty, and they have a more viscous secretion that's going to contain some organic molecules, and they'll be associated with bacteria that will produce odors. These are involved in producing odors that happen when in adults, and they produce pheromones that can attract or repel members of one sex or another. Below there you see a little bit of the distribution of the sweat glands. The blue, I think, are the eccrine sweat glands. They're most abundant on the head, the hands, and the feet, but they're on all body surfaces. The apocrine sweat glands are most abundant on the head and shoulders and in the armpits, and to a lesser extent in the pubic region. Other modified sweat glands are found in the ear canal, and the mammary glands are modified sweat glands. Okay, I don't want to say too much about nails. Nails are kind of like a large flattened hair follicle. The nail body sits on a nail bed, and then there's a root that is underneath it, and at the base of the root, new nail matrix is produced. Just like with the hairs, these are keratinized cells that are cemented together. It protects the ends of the fingers and the toes, and if you've ever damaged a nail, you know that it's delicate tissue underneath there. Okay, so it's the skin, large organ made of two tissues. Epithelial tissues on top form the epidermis. Connective tissues underneath form the dermis. The upper epithelial cells are found in different layers. Cells are continuously moving up from the deepest layers. As they move up, they accumulate keratin and lipids, keratohyalin and elidin. At the stratum cornea, you have dead cells that are shed. Melanin gives the skin its color. Melanocytes are in the stratum basale, and they transfer melanin to keratinocytes via these melanosomes. The papillary layer of the dermis projects finger-like extensions into the epidermis. It contains sensory cells, blood vessels, and immune cells. The reticular layer of the dermis contains lots of collagen for strength, elastin so that it's stretchy. It also contains the accessory organs. Okay, there's a nice picture of an actual photo of a hair follicle. Okay, I'll talk more about skin function in the next program.